You think ground beef meals were just meatloaf and sloppy joes? Think again. Before recipe cards and cooking shows, grandmothers across America stretched a single pound of ground beef into dishes that fed entire families for days. Let's dig into 30 easy ground beef meals Grandma made without a recipe that have completely disappeared. Beef and potato hash was the weeknight miracle that turned yesterday's potatoes into tonight's hearty supper. Grandmothers would dice leftover boiled potatoes and fry them in bacon grease until the edges crisped golden brown, then crumble in ground beef seasoned with salt, pepper, and a shake of paprika. The mixture sizzled together in cast iron skillets until the beef browned and the potatoes absorbed those savory drippings. Onions went in early, softening and sweetening as they cooked down. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that tasted like home. Families of 6 could eat well on a pound of meat when it was stretched with cheap potatoes from the root cellar. Fathers came home from factory shifts to find this waiting on the table. Children grew up associating that smell of crisping potatoes and browning beef with security itself. Nothing was measured, nothing written down, yet it came out perfect every single time. Loose meat sandwiches fed entire Midwestern towns before fast food chains existed. Ground beef was crumbled into skillets and cooked until browned, then seasoned with onion, a splash of Worcestershire sauce, and sometimes a spoonful of mustard stirred right into the meat. The mixture stayed loose and crumbly, never bound together like meatloaf, giving it a texture that was uniquely satisfying. Spooned onto soft hamburger buns and topped with pickles and yellow mustard, these sandwiches became the affordable alternative to proper hamburgers. Small-town diners and church basement suppers served them by the hundreds. A single pound of beef made enough filling for 8 sandwiches when stretched properly with onion. Working families relied on them because the filling could be made ahead and reheated without losing quality. Children begged for them at school functions while parents appreciated how far the meat stretched. This was community food that brought people together over something simple. Hamburger gravy poured over biscuits was the meal that made empty pantries feel abundant. Ground beef was browned in a skillet, then flour was sprinkled over the meat and stirred until it coated everything evenly. Milk went in slowly, stirred constantly until the mixture thickened into rich, creamy gravy studded with seasoned beef. The gravy was ladled generously over split biscuits baked fresh or pulled from yesterday's batch. Salt and pepper were the only seasonings needed, though some grandmothers added a dash of sage. This dish cost pennies, yet delivered satisfaction that expensive meals couldn't match. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner, depending on the day. Farm families ate it before dawn chores, while city families stretched it across weeknight suppers. The gravy could be thinned with more milk to feed extra mouths when company arrived. Children scraped their plates clean while parents exchanged knowing glances about the budget. Stuffed cabbage rolls carried old-world traditions into American kitchens where ground beef met resourcefulness. Grandmothers blanched whole cabbage heads until the leaves softened enough to peel away, then filled each leaf with ground beef, cooked rice, onion, and seasoning. The rolls were tucked snugly into Dutch ovens, covered with tomato sauce stretched from canned tomatoes. Hours of slow baking transformed the rolls into tender parcels where the beef melded with sweetened cabbage and tangy sauce. 1 head of cabbage and a pound of beef could feed a family for 2 days when the rice stretched the filling properly. Eastern European immigrant families brought these recipes in their memories, adapting them without ever writing anything down. The rolls appeared at Sunday dinners and holiday tables, marking special occasions without breaking the budget. Leftover rolls reheated beautifully, often tasting better the second day. This was the food of grandmothers who remembered scarcity. American chop suey had nothing to do with Chinese cooking, but everything to do with feeding hungry families cheaply. Ground beef was browned with onions and celery, then combined with elbow macaroni and canned tomatoes in one big pot that simmered until everything melted together. The dish went by different names. Some called it goulash, others called it slumgullion, but the principle was always the same. Stretch the meat with pasta and vegetables until a single pound fed 8 people comfortably. Grandmothers adjusted based on what was available, adding green peppers when the garden produced or leaving them out when money was tight. The tomato base could come from fresh tomatoes, canned sauce, or even ketchup thinned with water. Families gathered around kitchen tables with big serving spoons, filling bowls with this stew-like mixture. Children grew up thinking this was gourmet food because it was served with such love. The recipe required no measuring, just instinct passed from mother to daughter. Poor man's steak transformed ground beef into something resembling expensive cuts families couldn't afford. A pound of beef was mixed with crushed crackers, egg, and seasonings, then shaped into oval patties meant to mimic sirloin steaks. These patties were dredged in flour and fried until crusty on the outside, then smothered in onion gravy made from the pan drippings. The crackers stretched the meat while keeping the patties tender and moist inside. Served alongside mashed potatoes, this meal gave working families the feeling of abundance without the price tag. Fathers sat at the head of the table cutting into their poor man's steak with pride. The gravy was essential, turning simple fried patties into something that felt celebratory. Grandmothers shaped these patties with hands that had made thousands before, never needing a recipe card. The dish appeared on payday when spirits were high and on lean weeks when creativity mattered most. Beef and noodle casserole was the covered dish that showed up at every church potluck and neighborhood gathering. Ground beef was browned with onions, combined with egg noodles and canned cream of mushroom soup, then baked until bubbling and golden on top. The soup created a creamy sauce that held everything together while the noodles absorbed those beefy flavors. Crushed potato chips or buttered breadcrumbs went on top for crunch, turning a simple casserole into something children fought over. This was the dish grandmothers made when feeding a crowd or when grieving families needed meals delivered. The casserole traveled well in foil-covered pans and reheated without losing its appeal. 1 pound of beef stretched to serve 12 when the noodles and soup did their work. Families relied on it for weeknight suppers assembled in minutes. The recipe existed only in memory, adjusted each time based on what the pantry held. Spanish rice with ground beef brought warmth and color to tables across America during the mid-century years. Ground beef was browned with onions and green peppers. Then uncooked rice was stirred in and toasted slightly before canned tomatoes and water were added. The pot simmered covered until the rice absorbed all the liquid, turning tender and deeply flavored with tomato and beef. Cumin, chili powder, and garlic gave it warmth that made the kitchen smell like something special. This one-pot meal required no side dishes and could feed 6 people from a single pound of meat. Grandmothers learned it from neighbors, from church cookbooks, from watching their own mothers work without measuring spoons. The dish was forgiving, adjusting to whatever vegetables were available. Leftovers went into tortillas for lunch the next day, or were simply reheated with a splash of water. It represented practical cooking that turned cheap ingredients into something families genuinely craved. Shepherd's pie without the lamb was how American grandmothers adapted the British classic to budgets and tastes. Ground beef was browned with onions and mixed with whatever vegetables were available: peas, carrots, corn, green beans, then spread in a baking dish and topped with mashed potatoes. The whole thing baked until the potatoes turned golden brown and the filling bubbled up around the edges. Grandmothers made this when they needed one dish to serve as the entire meal, complete with meat, vegetables, and starch. The mashed potato topping could be piped fancy for company or simply spread with a fork for Tuesday supper. Families ate it straight from the baking dish, scooping portions that included every layer. The dish used up leftover mashed potatoes and any vegetables that needed cooking. 1 pound of beef beneath all those potatoes and vegetables fed 8 people satisfied. This was the cooking of women who never wasted anything. Porcupine meatballs got their name from the rice that poked out like quills after cooking. Ground beef was mixed with uncooked rice, egg, onion, and seasonings, then shaped into balls and nestled into baking dishes. Tomato sauce or soup was poured over the top, and everything baked covered until the rice cooked through and the meatballs turned tender. The rice absorbed the tomato liquid as it cooked, swelling and poking through the meat in ways that delighted children and stretched the meal further. 1 pound of beef made a dozen large meatballs when the rice did its work, enough to feed a family with plenty of sauce for sopping with bread. Grandmothers made these when they wanted something playful without extra effort. The dish could simmer on the stovetop or bake in the oven, adapting to whatever else was happening in the kitchen. Children loved naming the funny-looking meatballs, while parents appreciated how far the ingredients stretched. Beef and macaroni skillet was the one-pan wonder that got dinner on the table in 30 minutes flat. Ground beef was browned in a large skillet, then dry elbow macaroni was added right into the pan along with canned tomatoes, water, and seasonings. The whole thing simmered covered until the pasta turned tender and absorbed the tomato beef liquid into something rich and saucy. No separate pot for boiling pasta, no draining, no extra dishes to wash afterward. This was the meal grandmothers made when time was short and children were hungry and patience was wearing thin. The skillet went straight to the table where families served themselves from the pan. 1 pound of beef and a box of macaroni fed 6 hungry mouths without complaint. Seasonings varied by household. Some added oregano and garlic, others kept it simple with just salt and pepper. The dish was forgiving of distracted cooks and hungry children sneaking bites before dinner was called. Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy turned ground beef into something that felt like Sunday dinner on a Wednesday budget. Beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and minced onion, then shaped into oval patties and pan-fried until browned on both sides. The patties were removed while mushrooms and more onions were sautéed in the drippings. Then flour and beef broth created a rich brown gravy. The steaks returned to the pan to simmer in that gravy until everything melded together into pure comfort. This wasn't cafeteria food, despite what school lunches later did to the name. This was homemade elegance on a working-class budget. Grandmothers served it over egg noodles or mashed potatoes, the gravy pooling in delicious puddles. Families who couldn't afford real steak ate this with the same satisfaction, never feeling deprived. The mushrooms stretched the gravy while adding earthiness that made the dish taste more expensive than it was. Johnny Marzetti was the casserole that sustained Ohio church suppers and school cafeterias for decades. Ground beef was browned with onions and green peppers, then combined with cooked egg noodles, tomato sauce, and shredded cheese in deep baking pans. The casserole baked until the cheese melted and the edges bubbled with tomato sauce turned slightly caramelized. Named after a restaurant owner's brother, the dish spread through Midwestern communities via church cookbooks and school lunch programs. Grandmothers made it when they needed to feed 20 people without breaking the family budget. The recipe was infinitely adjustable. More noodles when money was tight, more beef when times were good. Mushrooms appeared in some versions, olives in others, but the core remained beef, noodles, tomato, and cheese. Children grew up eating this at potlucks and came home asking their mothers to make it. The casserole represented community cooking at its finest, adapted by every family who made it. Hamburger pie with biscuit topping was the answer to what's for dinner when the pantry held almost nothing. Ground beef was browned with onions, seasoned with salt and pepper, then spread in a baking dish and covered with canned vegetables, usually green beans or corn. Biscuit dough was dropped by spoonfuls over the top, or a single sheet was rolled out and draped over everything. The whole thing baked until the biscuits turned golden and the filling bubbled underneath. This was the meal that used up whatever canned goods were gathering dust in the cupboard and whatever vegetables needed cooking before they turned. Grandmothers made it when grocery money ran short and creativity was the only ingredient in abundance. The biscuit topping could be made from scratch or from a tube, depending on time and resources. Children loved breaking through the biscuit crust to discover the savory filling beneath. 1 pound of beef beneath all that biscuit and vegetables fed a family completely satisfied. Stuffed green peppers stood like little cups of comfort on dinner plates across America. Grandmothers cut the tops off bell peppers and removed the seeds, then stuffed each one with a mixture of ground beef, cooked rice, onion, and tomato sauce. The peppers stood upright in baking dishes, more tomato sauce poured around them, and everything baked until the peppers softened and the filling cooked through completely. The rice stretched the meat while absorbing all those beefy, tomatoey flavors during the long bake. 6 peppers from a garden and 1 pound of beef made dinner for the whole family when the rice did its stretching work. The stuffed peppers were self-contained meals. Meat, starch, and vegetable all in one edible package. Grandmothers grew peppers specifically for this dish, timing the harvest with ground beef sales at the grocery store. Leftovers reheated beautifully for lunch the next day. This was the kind of practical cooking that made limited ingredients feel like abundance. Hamburger stroganoff brought a taste of elegance to tables where real beef stroganoff was financially impossible. Ground beef was browned with onions, then sour cream and canned cream of mushroom soup were stirred in to create a rich, tangy sauce. The mixture was served over egg noodles that had been boiled separately and buttered generously. This wasn't authentic Russian cuisine. It was American adaptation that made fancy-sounding food accessible to working families. The sour cream added richness that made the dish taste more expensive than its ingredients suggested. Grandmothers made it when company was coming, and they wanted to impress without emptying the grocery budget. The dish came together quickly once the beef was browned, making it perfect for weeknights when time was precious. Children who had never tasted real stroganoff grew up thinking this version was the genuine article. The noodles absorbed the creamy sauce while the beef provided substance that satisfied hungry appetites. Shipwreck casserole got its name from throwing everything together like survivors salvaging supplies. Raw ground beef was layered in a baking dish with sliced potatoes, onions, celery, and canned kidney beans. Then tomato sauce was poured over everything. The casserole baked covered for over an hour until the potatoes turned tender and the beef cooked through completely. No browning the meat first, no pre-cooking anything. Just layer and bake and let the oven do all the work. This was the meal grandmothers made when they needed dinner to cook itself while they handled other responsibilities. The layers melded together during the long bake, the beef juices flavoring the potatoes and beans beneath. 1 pound of meat stretched beneath all those vegetables fed 6 people who never complained about the simple preparation. The dish required no attention once it went into the oven, freeing grandmothers for other household work. This was practical cooking that valued efficiency as much as flavor. Beef and rice casserole was the covered dish that traveled to every potluck and returned home with an empty pan. Ground beef was browned with onions, combined with uncooked rice and canned cream of mushroom soup, then baked until the rice absorbed all the liquid. The soup created a creamy binding sauce while the rice swelled and turned tender inside the casserole. Cheese went on top during the last few minutes, melting into a golden layer that made children reach for seconds. This dish fed a crowd on almost nothing. 1 pound of beef, 1 cup of rice, and a can of soup served 12 people easily. Grandmothers made it for church suppers, funeral dinners, and any occasion where feeding many mattered more than impressing few. The casserole held well on buffet tables and reheated without losing its creamy texture. Families relied on it when company came unexpectedly and something needed to stretch. The recipe existed in memory alone, adjusted each time based on available ingredients. Chili Mac combined 2 beloved comfort foods into 1 pot of pure satisfaction. Ground beef was browned with onions and seasoned with chili powder, cumin, and garlic until the kitchen smelled like something special was happening. Canned tomatoes and kidney beans went in next, simmering together until the flavors melded. Elbow macaroni was cooked separately, then stirred into the chili mixture, creating a hearty dish that was more filling than either component alone. The pasta stretched the chili further while giving it body that satisfied even the hungriest appetites. Grandmothers made this when they wanted something warming on cold evenings without much effort. Shredded cheese and chopped onions went on top at the table, letting everyone customize their bowl. 1 pot fed the whole family with enough left over for lunch the next day. The dish was forgiving. More beans when meat was scarce, more pasta when beans ran low. This was the kind of adaptable cooking that made tight budgets work. Beef patties with brown gravy was the simple supper that appeared on tables when fancy wasn't possible or necessary. Ground beef was seasoned with salt, pepper, and a little Worcestershire sauce, then shaped into patties and fried in a skillet until browned. The patties were removed while flour was stirred into the drippings. Then beef broth or water was added to create a simple brown gravy. The patties returned to the pan to simmer in the gravy until everything was heated through and the flavors melded together. This wasn't hamburger steak with its binders and fillers, just pure beef with honest gravy made from the drippings. Grandmothers served this over rice or mashed potatoes, the gravy turning simple starch into something satisfying. 1 pound of beef made 4 large patties that fed the family when accompanied by plenty of gravy and sides. The dish required no recipe because there was nothing complicated about it, just technique passed from mother to daughter through observation. Hamburger vegetable soup was the pot that simmered on back burners across America whenever cold weather arrived. Ground beef was browned and crumbled, then added to large stock pots filled with whatever vegetables were available. Carrots, potatoes, celery, green beans, corn, cabbage. Canned tomatoes provided the base, while beef bouillon cubes added depth when homemade stock wasn't available. The soup simmered for hours, filling kitchens with steam and fragrance that drew families toward the stove. 1 pound of beef stretched across an enormous pot that fed the family for days, each reheating, making the soup taste better. Grandmothers made this when someone was sick, when money was tight, when comfort was needed more than anything else. The soup required no recipe, just instinct about what vegetables needed using and how much liquid to add. Children came home from school to find bowls waiting, crusty bread alongside for dunking. This was the soup that said everything would be all right. Beef and corn pudding was the savory custard that turned humble ingredients into something almost elegant. Ground beef was browned with onions, then spread in a baking dish and topped with a mixture of canned cream, corn, eggs, and milk. The whole thing baked until the corn mixture set into a soft, pudding-like layer over the seasoned beef beneath. The texture was unlike anything else, creamy corn custard giving way to savory meat with every spoonful. This wasn't a dish that appeared in fancy cookbooks, but it showed up at church suppers and family dinners where grandmothers wanted to make something different. The corn pudding stretched 1 pound of beef to feed 8 people when served with bread and a simple salad. Children loved the sweetness of the corn against the savory beef. The dish could be assembled ahead and baked when dinner time arrived. It represented the kind of quiet creativity that made ordinary ingredients feel special. Tater Tot hot dish was the Minnesota creation that became a Midwestern institution. Ground beef was browned with onions, spread in a baking dish, and covered with canned green beans and cream of mushroom soup. Frozen tater tots were arranged in neat rows on top, then everything baked until the tots turned crispy and the filling bubbled beneath. The dish was pure comfort, crunchy potato topping giving way to creamy soup and seasoned beef with vegetables scattered throughout. Grandmothers made it because children would eat every bite without complaint, and because it could be assembled in minutes from ingredients always kept on hand. Church basement suppers featured multiple versions, each grandmother insisting hers was the original. 1 pound of beef beneath all those tots and soup fed a family of 6 with leftovers for lunch. The casserole traveled well to potlucks and reheated without losing its appeal. This was the food of communities that valued practicality over pretension. Creamed beef on toast was the breakfast for dinner meal that working families relied on when time and money were both short. Ground beef was browned and crumbled, then stirred into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk. The creamy mixture was spooned over slices of toasted bread, creating a filling meal from ingredients every kitchen contained. Peas were sometimes stirred in for color and nutrition, stretching the dish further while adding sweetness. This wasn't glamorous food, but it delivered the protein and carbohydrates that hardworking bodies needed. Grandmothers made it on weeknights when fancier meals weren't possible, knowing their families would leave the table satisfied. Children grew up eating this without realizing it was budget food. They just knew it tasted good. The dish came together in 15 minutes and required no special ingredients or techniques. 1 pound of beef and all that creamy sauce served 6 people easily. It was honest food for honest appetites. Hamburger steaks with onion gravy elevated simple beef patties into something that felt like a proper dinner. Ground beef was shaped into thick oval patties and seared in a hot skillet until a brown crust formed on both sides. Sliced onions were added to the pan and cooked until soft and golden. Then flour and beef broth created a rich gravy that the patties simmered in until done. The onions melted into the gravy, sweetening it naturally while the beef juices added depth and richness. This wasn't fancy restaurant food, but it satisfied like nothing else on a cold evening. Grandmothers served it over mashed potatoes or rice, ensuring the gravy had somewhere to pool and be sopped up with bread. 1 pound of beef made 4 generous steaks that fed the family alongside plenty of sides. The dish required attention at the stove but rewarded that effort with flavor. It proved that simple ingredients handled well-created meals worth remembering. Beef and bean bake was the budget stretcher that turned a pound of meat into a feast for the whole family. Ground beef was browned with onions, then combined with canned pork and beans, a splash of ketchup, brown sugar, and mustard in a baking dish. The mixture baked until bubbling and slightly caramelized around the edges, the sweet and tangy sauce coating every bite. This wasn't fancy food. It was picnic food, potluck food, the kind of dish that showed up at every outdoor gathering. Grandmothers made it because the beans stretched the meat impossibly far while the sauce made everything taste better. Children loved the sweetness while parents appreciated how far 1 pound of beef could go. The dish could be doubled or tripled easily for larger crowds. It traveled well and held on buffet tables without losing quality. Beef and bean bake represented practical cooking at its most satisfying, proving that economy and flavor could coexist. Skillet beef and cabbage was the one-pan meal that immigrant families brought from the old country and adapted to American kitchens. Ground beef was browned with onions in a large skillet, then shredded cabbage was piled on top and covered to steam until wilted. Caraway seeds, salt, and pepper were the only seasonings needed to transform these humble ingredients. The cabbage absorbed the beefy drippings as it cooked down, becoming silky and sweet while the meat stayed savory beneath. 1 head of cabbage and a pound of beef fed 6 people a complete meal without any side dishes needed. Grandmothers made this when money was tight and gardens or markets offered cheap cabbage. The dish came together quickly and required only 1 pan to wash afterward. Children who resisted vegetables somehow ate cabbage prepared this way without complaint. It was the cooking of necessity that became the cooking of comfort, passed down through families who never forgot where they came from. Hamburger pie with mashed potato crust was the inside-out shepherd's pie that appeared when creativity mattered more than convention. Ground beef was browned with onions and seasoned simply, then poured into a pie plate that had been lined with mashed potatoes pressed up the sides like a crust. More mashed potatoes went on top, sealing the filling inside before the whole thing baked until golden. The potatoes formed a soft shell around the savory beef, each slice revealing layers of meat and starch. Grandmothers made this when they had leftover mashed potatoes and needed to stretch 1 pound of beef into dinner for 6. The dish could be assembled ahead and baked when the family gathered. Children loved cutting into the potato crust to discover the filling inside. It was different enough to feel special, but simple enough for weeknight cooking. This pie represented the ingenuity of women who never wasted food. Beef and tomato macaroni was the stripped-down version of American chop suey that required even fewer ingredients. Ground beef was browned in a skillet, then cooked macaroni and canned tomatoes were stirred in with salt, pepper, and a pinch of sugar to balance the acidity. The mixture simmered until the tomatoes broke down and coated everything in a simple, satisfying sauce. No celery, no peppers, no fancy seasonings. Just beef, pasta, and tomatoes the way grandmothers made it when the pantry held nothing else. This was the meal of truly lean times, when stretching ingredients meant survival. 1 pound of beef, 1 box of macaroni, and 1 can of tomatoes fed a family without complaint. Children ate it without knowing how little it cost, just that it tasted like home and love and warmth. The dish required no recipe because there was nothing to measure, just proportions learned by watching. It was poverty cooking that somehow tasted like abundance. Depression meat pie was the covered dish casserole that carried families through the hardest years. Ground beef was browned and stretched with oatmeal or breadcrumbs, seasoned with onion and whatever herbs were available, then spread in a baking dish. A simple pie crust made from flour, lard, and water covered the top, sealing in the filling before everything baked until golden. The crust turned flaky while the filling stayed moist, each slice revealing the clever stretching that made a little meat go far. Grandmothers made this during the 1930s and kept making it through the war years and beyond. The recipe required no measuring, just hands that knew how much flour to add and eyes that recognized when the crust looked right. Families gathered around tables to eat this pie with gratitude for having food at all. It represented survival and hope during impossible times. The dish has nearly vanished from modern kitchens, but it deserves remembering. Another staple of our United States cuisine, beef and bean chili. Ooh, my grandma knew how to make that chili right. This wasn't the watery, mild stuff you might get from a can. No, this was a thick, hearty, beef and bean-packed chili that stuck to your ribs and made you forget about the cold weather outside. Ground beef, kidney beans, tomatoes, and a fiery blend of spices. Grandma's secret weapon was always a dash of chili powder and maybe a little cocoa powder if she was feeling fancy. Simmered to perfection, the rich, meaty sauce soaked into every bite. And the beans? Well, they weren't just filler. They added a creamy texture that balanced the beefy goodness. Whether served with cornbread, crackers, or just a dollop of sour cream on top, Grandma's chili could warm even the coldest of souls. Now, you might have noticed how I'm trying to avoid mentioning the origins of chili. And if you're from the south of the United States, you probably know why. Chili has roots in the American Southwest, but variations can be found all over the country. Some swear by no beans, which may come as a shocker, I know, but at Grandma's beans were a must. They made the chili stretch further, which meant more leftovers, because the only thing better than chili is day-old chili. Ground beef and heirloom. Bean chili was not just a dinner, it was a memory in a bowl. Picture a heavy pot hanging over a campfire filled with ground beef simmering alongside a rainbow of heirloom beans. Pinto beans, black beans, cranberry beans, all the ones your grandmother insisted were better than anything from a can. The beef gave it depth, the beans gave it body, and a handful of crushed wild herbs gave it a smoky aroma that floated through the night air. It was not the tongue-searing chili you find at competitions today either. This was smooth, mellow, and rich, made to be eaten with big hunks of bread or scooped right out of the pot with a wooden spoon. After a long day of work or a night under the stars, nothing tasted better. If you were lucky, there was always a second pot heating up for breakfast too, because good chili was not something you left behind. Now, if you thought a pot of campfire chili could make a night unforgettable, just wait until you see how a little cedar smoke could turn plain beef into backyard magic. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet-savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of 3 different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy Chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Shepherd's pie, the cozy blanket of food. This classic comfort food originated with the clever idea of layering leftover ground beef with mashed potatoes. Shepherd's pie is believed to have been invented in the early 1800s. During this time, housewives were struggling to find innovative ways to recycle the leftovers that their husbands and kids had turned up their noses at. Now, buckle up for a brief history lesson. The British and some of the Protestant Irish converts became the new rulers, while Irish Catholics who refused to convert became peasant farm workers living in humble homes referred to as cottages. Around 1589, Sir Walter Raleigh introduced potato farming to Ireland, and over time, potatoes gained acceptance in Ireland since they were not only delicious but also affordable for the poor. Towards the end of the 18th century, a new dish known as cottage pie came about. It is believed that it originated as a way for women to make use of the leftovers to avoid food wastage. After making the delicious weekend roast, all unused meat was carefully repurposed into a pie using affordable potatoes as a crust. Shepherd's pie became one of the best ways to deal with leftover meat. As an added bonus, it was, and still is, extremely delicious. Crispy corn cakes. Stuffed with seasoned beef were one of those foods you could smell cooking before you even stepped into the event. Little golden discs sizzling in big iron skillets, stuffed to the brim with ground beef seasoned with paprika, onions, and a pinch of chili powder if you wanted to wake up your taste buds. The outside was crunchy and golden, the inside savory and juicy. It was a dance of textures that made you keep reaching for just one more. The trick was to keep the corn cakes thin enough that they crisped up, but thick enough to hold all that seasoned beef inside without falling apart. At powwows and fairs, you would see kids running around with one in each hand, faces smeared with beefy goodness, while the elders sat back and nodded approvingly. It was simple, it was satisfying, and it was the perfect food for big gatherings where nobody had time for forks and knives. And if you think crispy stuffed corn cakes sound irresistible, wait until you pull up a camp chair and hear about the kind of chili that made starry nights and crackling fires taste even better. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. One of those happened to beef and peanut butter casseroles, and before you exit the video, hear me out. Beef and peanut butter casserole is a fascinating example of how people can get really creative when the stakes are high. This is a dish that has its roots in Great Depression thrifting and ingenuity. If you think it sounds really unusual, you're right, but you're also probably only thinking about this from a flavor perspective instead of what it can do for your body. Most people realized that the protein potential of this was off the charts. It combined peanut butter, which was already carrying loads of the stuff with beef, and it was a meal that could be stretched out to feed an entire family. Plus, despite how we regularly associate peanut butter with sweeter confections, it's actually been something that's constantly thrown into savory recipes too. This was a casserole that emerged all the way in the 1930s or 1940s, but peaked in the 60s. And this was because it was only in those early decades that peanut butter even began to be commonly available in most people's homes. It's got a lot in common with some Thai peanut beef dishes too. Shipwreck casserole had a name that made you curious and a flavor that made you stay. No one really knows where the name came from. Some say it is because it used whatever ingredients survived in the pantry. Others say it is just what happened to your kitchen when you made it. But if you were growing up in the 1960s or 1970s, you probably saw this show up on your plate more than once. Ground beef was the anchor, and from there, things got creative. Potatoes, sliced thin or cubed chunky, laid the foundation. Rice, usually the minute kind, came in next. Then canned tomatoes, the workhorse of every budget-friendly meal, tied it all together in a bubbling, slightly tangy mix that somehow always hit the spot. And if you think that is resourceful, wait until you see what happened when people tried to make steak rolls without the steak. Moving on to something that is American-made, Salisbury steak, seasoned ground beef patties, pan-seared to perfection and then smothered in a rich onion-loaded gravy? What's not to like? I bet most of you haven't heard the backstory of Salisbury steak, so let me educate you. It is best known as a staple of TV dinners and bargain buffets. The Salisbury steak actually has its beginnings as a proposed cure for digestive illness during the Civil War. If you didn't know, digestive illnesses killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did, and a diet rich in beefsteak and coffee was one suggested cure. The inventor of the Salisbury steak, Dr. James Henry Salisbury, was an early pioneer of germ theory and of diet being a factor in health. While some of his ideas may be outdated today, his affection for beefsteak and his promotion of its positive effect on health have persisted. While patties of ground beef are common fare, the Salisbury steak was cemented in the American lexicon during World War I. In many English-speaking countries, there was a movement to limit the use of German-sounding words, so the army served Salisbury steak rather than Hamburg steak and Liberty sandwiches instead of hamburgers. Sure, it may not be the health trend it once was, but let's be honest, it's a comfort food icon for a reason. Ground beef and wild mustard greens. Stir-fry was the kind of meal that showed up fast and disappeared even faster. This was not some high-end stir-fry piled with expensive sauces either. It was a down-home skillet sizzler made with ground beef cooked hot and fast, tossed with handfuls of peppery wild mustard greens, plucked fresh from wherever you could find them. Those greens had bite, real bite, and they gave the beef this sharp, earthy pop that plain old spinach could only dream of. A splash of vinegar, a sprinkle of salt, and maybe a little bacon grease if you had it lying around, and you had a dish that punched way above its weight. It was light enough for summer, hearty enough for winter, and cheap enough to keep families fed when money was just a rumor. Stir-fries like these were the ultimate in practical magic, a fast meal that felt like you had been planning it all day. And if you thought a pile of spicy greens and sizzling beef was as good as it gets, just wait until you bite into a crispy pocket filled with beef and roasted roots, the kind of thing great-grandma used to make when the nights got cold. Beefy bread pudding was supposed to be a savory spin on a traditional bread pudding. You know, throw in some imagination and fun in there for the sake of it. It originated as a way to actually get rid of stale bread. You'll notice that throughout this list, people found a lot of uses for stale bread. Now, we would probably just throw it out, but most people thought that there was no need to waste something that could still be made into a decent dish. In the early 20th century in America, beefy bread pudding started to evolve into a casserole-style dish because that was just a far more convenient way of making it. The shift we have towards the end of the 20th century towards lighter meals and smaller portions is because individualized eating really became a thing. People could literally order whatever they wanted, specialized, processed, and canned to their every craving. Back in the start of the 20th century, meals still had to be made with respect to how good they were at feeding the whole family. Beefy bread pudding happened to be pretty damn good at doing that, especially when it comes with mashed potatoes as a side or some gravy. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that sloppy joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling, ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory, sloppy Joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. Don't confuse regular old boring meatloaf with this special Dutch oven meatloaf with crackers. No, don't get your wires crossed, it's definitely different. Back in the day, Grandma really knew how to jazz things up and make this classic into something unexpected, just by adding some crackers. When crackers are added to the mix, they become like little sponges full of flavor, absorbing juices and adding to the texture of the dish. but this still doesn't really make it that different from the regular meatloaf. So where does the difference lie? Well, it lies in the Dutch oven baking. This oven, or pot as some might say, locks in flavor and moisture like nothing you've ever seen before. The result? A tender, savory meatloaf with a perfectly crisp outer layer. And Grandma knew how to serve it right, with a thick layer of ketchup glaze on top. Because sometimes, more is more. Plus, when you add a side of mashed potatoes, it'll be like you're biting into nostalgia. Back in the Great Depression, meatloaf was a go-to because it stretched a small amount of beef into a meal for the whole family. And crackers were cheaper than breadcrumbs, and we all know Grandma knows how to save some bucks. Nostalgic beef and sweet corn fry casserole was the dish that looked like a mess but tasted like a memory. Imagine browned ground beef bubbling under a thick layer of golden sweet corn kernels, all tied together with a few shakes of salt and pepper and a little bit of cream if you had it. Baked until the top got crispy and the edges turned caramel brown, it was the kind of casserole that made the whole house smell like comfort. In the 1970s, every family potluck or backyard gathering had at least one version of it, usually scribbled onto a crumpled index card or passed down by word of mouth. Sweet corn was cheap, beef was precious, and when you married the two together, you got a dish that somehow managed to feel luxurious, even when times were lean. The first spoonful always hit you with that sweet, salty magic, and before you knew it, you were scraping the sides of the pan for just one more bite. And if you thought this casserole was the gold standard of hearty, simple eats, just wait until you dive into a beef and hominy masterpiece that practically invented stick-to-your-ribs cooking. Banana meatloaf is an incredibly practical recipe that emerged from times where frugality was almost as much of a virtue as cleanliness. Rationing, resourcefulness, and economic hardship were how everyone was getting by. And this was only more true during the worst parts of the Great Depression and World War II. Home cooks were forced to work with very few ingredients, and the typical banana meatloaf recipe was something that was very bare bones and required little prep work or elaborate lists of ingredients to create. All you needed for this was pork mixed with mashed ripe bananas. Throw in some breadcrumbs, which could be repurposed from stale bread, onions, which most people were already stocking up on or growing, and basic seasonings like pepper, nutmeg, and salt, and you had yourself a pretty all-right dish. The banana worked as a binder and a natural sweetener, and it would often work really well with Worcestershire sauce, believe it or not. It helped balance out the incredible sweetness of ripe bananas. This dish did particularly well in Hawaii, where it was appreciated for blending in with already existing preferences. Rag mop casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Ah, the classic beef and potato casserole. Reminds me of a time when 40-step recipes from Instagram didn't exist, and it was all about simplicity and comfort. The layers of browned ground beef, golden potatoes, and a creamy sauce could warm even the coldest hearts. Topped with a generous amount of cheese, of course, because when you're at Grandma's, more cheese equals more love. Why was this dish suddenly forgotten? Maybe it's because all of the new recipes call for superfoods and gluten-free alternatives, which this casserole is definitely not. It's a classic, old-school ground beef dish. The magic of beef and potato casserole lies in its simplicity. It's basically just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly. No fuss. It's hearty and delicious. Plus, Who doesn't love a meal where everything is combined into one pan? Less cleanup means more time in front of the TV watching your favorite 80s sitcom. Seconds are almost always guaranteed, so you could also say that this dish is perfect for meal stretches and it's budget-friendly. No worries. Crispy fried beef and root vegetable pockets were not just dinner. They were survival disguised as a treat. Picture dough rolled thin, packed full of seasoned ground beef, diced carrots, sweet potatoes, and turnips, then folded tight and fried until golden and flaky. It was like the first generation of the hand pies everyone brags about today, only made from scratch, with love and whatever you had left in the root cellar. These little pockets were the ultimate grab-and-go meal before drive-thrus were even a thing. They stayed warm wrapped in cloth, perfect for long days in the fields or a chilly walk to the town market. Every bite was crispy outside, juicy and tender inside, with the sweet earthiness of the root veggies soaking up all the beefy flavor. Families would make dozens at a time and stash them away for later, if they managed to last that long. Now, if you think stuffing beef and veggies into a crispy golden package sounds brilliant, wait until you hear about the Sunday classic that brought sage, beef, and cornbread together into something that tasted a whole lot like home. Beef stuffed donuts are a really bizarre thing to think about. They actually have been a part of tradition for so long. What tradition, you might ask? Well, savory fried dough dishes have been pretty consistently popular across America, believe it or not. Just look at all the meat pies we have. Unlike today's sweet donuts topped with chocolate frosting and red velvet, though, these were a popular way to make some portable food that also filled you up. Different versions of meat-filled fried donuts looked like beef mixed with onions and garlic, or gravy, or even cheese on the inside. So why did something so good disappear? Well, it's just hard to keep up with all the different things the world had to offer. Pre-packaged donuts, frozen ones, ready-made baked goods, all of it meant that people were far less interested in doing basic home baking the usual. Nowadays even, if someone does want to get cooking, they usually think about something that can at least get a couple of views. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. Johnny Marzetti might just be the ultimate comfort food you've been missing out on. It's an old-school casserole that was once a staple in Midwestern kitchens, but has since fallen off the radar for many. Imagine this: a bubbling, cheesy dish of noodles, tender ground beef, and zesty tomato sauce, all baked together in a warm, gooey hug. It's basically the casserole version of a cozy sweater on a chilly day. This dish has an interesting backstory. Created in the early 1900s at Marzetti's restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, it was named after the brother of the restaurant's owner, Teresa Marzetti. Word has it that Johnny Marzetti became so popular it spread like wildfire across homes, schools, and church potlucks throughout the Midwest. It was affordable, easy to make, and could feed a crowd. What's not to love? What makes Johnny Marzetti so special is how adaptable it is. Want to throw in some veggies like peppers or mushrooms? Go for it. Craving a little extra kick? Add some crushed red pepper or Italian seasoning. And if you're a cheese lover, and who isn't, feel free to go overboard with layers of mozzarella, cheddar, or parmesan. The best part? It tastes even better the next day as leftovers when all the flavors have had time to mingle and marry. Traditional Cedar smoked beef skewers were one of those dishes that proved you did not need 1,000 ingredients to create something unforgettable. Beef was marinated with just salt, pepper, and maybe a brush of honey if you were feeling wild, then threaded onto wooden sticks and slow roasted over cedar branches. The cedar smoke wrapped itself around the beef, sinking deep into every fiber, turning a simple skewer into a feast that could make even the grumpiest neighbor smile. You would find folks gathered around fire pits, laughing and trading stories while keeping an eye on their skewers, turning them every so often to get that perfect even char. There was something about the smell of cedar smoke that felt like a hug from nature itself, especially when it meant that dinner was almost ready. Kids would sneak bites straight off the sticks, adults would pile them high on plates, and nobody ever left hungry. And if you thought cedar smoke could work miracles on plain beef, wait until you see how mustard greens and ground beef teamed up for one of the most overlooked flavor combos in history. Meat Jell-O, or more commonly known as aspic, is one of the best creations to ever come out of Western culinary history. In this entire list, we have a growing pattern of people mixing gelatinous textures alongside sweet and savory flavors, and this dish was arguably the ultimate culmination of that entire trend. So aspic was actually something that people usually associated with fine dining. It was also used to encase these fancy poached meats which were sometimes imported, plus the thing just looked really fancy. Starts to make sense when you think about it. The early 20th century saw it turning into more of a generalized thing, though. The bizarre evolution of meat Jell-O was really defined by commercialized powdered gelatin and canned soups, which meant that home cooks now had all the tools they needed to make as many aspic-based wonders as they wanted. It's still pretty hot today, comparatively. Porcupine meatballs were a staple during the Great Depression, but they've managed to stick around since then. Meat, even something as mundane as ground beef, was expensive, and home cooks used innovation and imaginative ways to make a small amount of protein stretch to feed a large and hungry family. Porcupine meatballs were one of the answers to the problem. And while they may sound exotic, don't worry, no porcupines are being harmed. These little meatballs get their name from the way uncooked rice pokes out of them during cooking, making them look like they're covered in tiny spikes. But don't worry, the spikes won't hurt you while eating. They're soft, tender, and full of flavor. This dish, with its rich tomato sauce, was perfect for serving over mashed potatoes or rice. There are a few alternatives to the old-school, classic porcupine meatballs. Like, for example, there are the Italian porcupine meatballs, which call for veggies, and brown rice, which is whole grain. So these meatballs were spiking with that nutritional value. Pun intended. Smothered ground. Beef and hominy was the kind of meal that did not just fill your plate, it filled your soul. Ground beef cooked slow and easy, seasoned with just enough spice to keep things interesting, and then tossed together with hominy so tender it almost melted in your mouth. If you have never had hominy before, just picture corn but bigger, puffier, and somehow even more satisfying. When the juices from the beef soaked into every kernel, you got a dish that was buttery, savory, and rich enough to carry you through an entire winter's night. Families back then knew that when you needed a dinner that would power you through long days and longer nights, this was it. It was not fancy food, but it was food that made you feel like you were winning at life, even when the cupboards were looking bare. Now, if you thought beef and hominy could turn a plain night into something unforgettable, get ready to bite into a dish that brought every powwow to life with a little bit of crunch and a whole lot of heart. Ground beef mayo loaf was a home cooking experiment that came out when mayonnaise started to become popular. I know that might seem like a shock to you because we've grown up exclusively in a world where mayonnaise and ketchup were like the only possible options for a sandwich off of the top of your head. But mayonnaise didn't always have that kind of top dog reputation. Meatloaves themselves have been around for many centuries, but the addition of mayonnaise to the mixture was something that came out in the 50s and 60s exclusively. It was promoted in community cookbooks too, and brands also wanted to highlight how good their mayonnaise was in different kinds of dishes, so they would pay for space in these cookbooks. Plus, mayonnaise is pretty dense calorically, so it fills you up. Now, a typical loaf looks like crushed crackers, eggs, Worcestershire sauce, and a lot of different seasonings, as well as a grated cheese and onion soup mix. They even had pickle relish thrown in there, and the loaf would have a mayonnaise glaze on top as well, mixed with mustard or barbecue sauce. beef and macaroni skillet. Now that's a one-pot wonder. The combination of ground beef, tender macaroni, and a tangy tomato sauce would be a hit with everyone at the table. The best part about macaroni skillet is that it only takes one pot to make, which leaves more time for desserts and less dishwashing. And who doesn't love that? This dish was basically Hamburger Helper before Hamburger Helper existed, but way better because it was homemade, or rather, grandma made. She'd brown the beef, stir in some garlic and onions, and maybe sneak in a few veggies, then toss in elbow macaroni and let it all simmer together. The noodles absorbed the rich flavors from the beef and sauce, creating a saucy, cheesy, beefy pasta dish that could make anyone happy after a long day. This dish became a staple during World War II, when rationing meant you had to get creative with minimal ingredients. But the homemade version definitely doesn't lack any ingredients. It's rich in flavor, and if I'm being honest, it's not totally cheap to prepare. Sage-infused ground beef patties might sound like something you would find in a fancy restaurant today, but back then, it was just another stroke of pure homegrown genius. Sage was everywhere in the right parts of the country, and it did not cost a dime to pick some fresh sprigs. Mixed into ground beef with a little salt and a whole lot of care, the result was a smoky, savory patty that smelled so good cooking, you would swear it could make a grown man cry. Fried up in an old cast iron pan until the edges were crispy and the middle stayed juicy, these patties were tossed onto plates with a scoop of beans, maybe some fried potatoes if you were lucky. They were not just filling, they were soul-satisfying. And once you tasted beef lifted up by wild sage, you would wonder why anyone ever bothered with plain salt and pepper again. Speaking of dishes that hit you right in the comfort zone, the next one was a staple at tables that needed stretching a meal just a little bit farther. Which ground beef meal from Grandma's kitchen do you miss most? Drop your memories in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe for more forgotten recipes that deserve to be remembered.